the law and regulations. So it is posing a huge threat to women's land rights and to indigenous land rights, to the Black population. We have a huge problem of racism in our country. So that's the first thing. Also, there is a concrete problem of hunger. People, and we are working on two different levels. The first levels, when we think about protecting lives and dignity, we are talking about hunger. We are talking about the informality and the inadequacy of living. We know that we have a huge 22% of our population living in slums without access to water, to drink water, sanitation. So there is a real threat to these populations. And yes, it is the insecurity of land. It affects essentially widows, and we have the widows of COVID. We affect the people in informal areas because it is informal. And so the land grabbers can go. And it's not just talking about big companies, multinational companies. We are talking about next door neighbors, and we see a lot of land grabbing that comes from a farmer who is next door. As I wrote a blog saying that in times of when someone dies in a community, during the funeral, people come to the widow to try to get her land. So that things are increasing enormously. And also, I think that so the situation right now, if you look at the indigenous population, what is happening in the Amazonia, but not just in the Amazonia, what is happening everywhere to the Quilombolas community. We were in a process of recognizing the rights of these communities, and also in the informal settlements. People are dying because of the police violence. So yes, it's a major concern for us to protect. We did a campaign, I don't have time to explain. Thinking about this, we did a campaign, and we, from the March 15 to yesterday, people were receiving food, supply. So we work in two different levels, protecting the lives, and protecting the lives in two different ways. Protecting the lives because of the COVID, supporting these women, feeding. We established a huge network to supply food, supply the basic things, alcohol, and we get a lot of donation from the private sector. So in the pandemic, we also get some surprise. We had in our campaign, we had a huge collaboration from the private sector, but also protecting rights and trying to establish, supporting the people to access these policies and emergential support from the government. It's just an allowance of $120. So we had to support people because everything is in the internet. You have to register on the internet, but also supporting the rights, informing the people. How can you support? How can you ensure your rights during this pandemic? So we got a network of of supporters, including lawyers and also governments, and we work with governments. So yes, I think that the COVID is it's a huge threat for us, and it's global.
Yeah, thank you, Patricia, for highlighting some of the challenges. And we can see that increased amounts of violence, and also together with that, the opportunity and the space to mobilize resources are also shrinking. And there are challenges in relation to that. We have highlighted technology, And also, this new COVID has created single women, and what about their property rights and their access to land, right? So we're going to elaborate that on a little bit more later on. I'm going to move on to Diana. Diana Fleishner. She's the Senior Director of Research, Evaluation and Learning at Landesa. Diana, already there are different stakeholders who are reporting on SDG targets. We know that 47 countries have reported in this year's high-level political forum. So stakeholders are engaging and they are reporting on the 2030 framework. Are they reporting on land rights? And what kind of progress are they talking about? Have you really made any progress? Diana?
Sorry, I was on mute. Good morning, everybody. Yes, this is a very timely conversation. As Patricia said before, COVID is, of course, exacerbating all the problems that people are facing, but the reality is many people around the world were already facing land rights challenges. And we all recognize that and understood that the SDGs were a good instrument to try to bring attention to these issues and compel governments to act and either grant or protect those rights. And so today it's a good opportunity to see how are we doing here. We thought in the past few years that we had a huge victory when we got land rights to be included in the SDGs, included under goals to eradicate poverty, to eliminate food insecurity, and to achieve gender equality. And it was a fantastic win. This is a very important tool that we can use. And yet we cannot take things for granted. The fact that these things are written in paper and that there are formal commitments doesn't necessarily mean that they will translate into change in reality. And so the big question today is, what are we doing? How are we doing? 5 of the 15 years have passed. And yes, having land rights in the agenda is a fantastic step, but countries have committed to many things under the SDGs. And countries have limited capacity, and countries already had some degree of infrastructure to deal with the other commitments. Addressing land rights issue, and particularly land rights of the people who are in a poor or vulnerable situation, and for women, requires resources and times and special attention. And so we know going in that this is a challenge. And to assess where we are, as Rukshana, you were saying, a good tool is to look at the voluntary national reviews. 47 of the almost 200 countries involved in this process agreed to review how they were doing on a handful of goals for the high-level political forum. Those goals include all the land rights commitments. So this is a key moment for those of us championing land rights. And the SDGs have the two sides. On the one hand, they allow us to celebrate progress, to look at who's being an effective champion of land rights and who we have to recognize. And in those cases, I think there's a few examples I can point out. The voluntary national reviews of Ecuador and Honduras, for example, talk about efforts to formalize land rights. In Ecuador, giving land titles to over 70,000 smallholders, small and medium agricultural holders. In Honduras, also a titling program. We can highlight work done by the government in Bangladesh that paid attention to women's land rights and reports working under a project called My House, My Farm to cover 40,000 villages in Bangladesh and guaranteeing or recognizing the rights of close to 700,000 women. We can recognize work done by the government of Tanzania, where they're going a different route. So we're not talking about documentation programs, but rather bringing stakeholders together, different government agencies and members of civil society under a multi-stakeholder platform that's coordinated by the Secretary of Gender to see how to advance women's land rights in a coordinated and cohesive way. And we also noticed a good example from Liberia, where the government has passed the Land Rights Act in 2018. This is an act that's very promising because it allows, it improves the access to land for rural people and better coordinates customary rights with statutory rights and so forth. So you see there is a handful of examples. There's also a few governments who have reported on the land rights indicators. But nice as this is, I have to say that these efforts are all promising efforts. For the most part, when they deliver, they're still in their initial stages. They're setting things in the right direction, or they have addressed the needs of a number of people, but still have to cover an additional significant gap. So we celebrate the steps that have taken. We recognize that there's still a fair amount of work to do for those countries. Now, you notice that I only mentioned a few examples. And the reality is that if we want to get to the type of world that we all aspire to see in the near future, we do need to move a lot farther, a lot faster, and a lot more deliberately. The vast majority of the countries who have reported, and I want to say that these are countries who chose to report this year and chose to report in a year where 3 of the goals mention explicitly land rights. The vast majority of the countries did not report one word about land rights. And the few who said something, in addition to the examples I mentioned earlier, have said very little and kept it fairly vague. And so I guess I want to recognize those who have taken action and those who have believed enough in the things to mention them and to highlight them when they report to the high-level political forum. But for those of us who are here who want to make sure there is a difference on the ground and that people can enjoy secure rights, this is a very important call to say we need to do more. And we need to, and I like that in this group, there's people from different sectors. We need to see what role can we play, each of us, to move in a direction that helps governments and everybody else really take the steps needed to guarantee these rights.
Yeah, thank you, Dana. I think it's also a very good segue to start the move on to the next speaker. But before that, I just want to say we were trying to get a speaker from a government. Unfortunately, at the last minute, she couldn't join. But anyway, there are member states actually, or member state representatives who are taking part in this webinar. And so please feel free to comment or even ask questions. We want to hear from you as well. So you said that there are very few governments who have actually reported on SDG land targets. So then who is going to report on that? Can the civil society report? So with that, I'm going to move on to the next panelist, who's Liv Nelson. And she works for the International Land Coalition's Latin America team. And she works on the initiative on SDGs and land. Liv, just want to ask how CSOs have grappled with these challenges that Patricia has mentioned, and then also Diana has mentioned in relation to like reporting and how they have tried to report. So what's your experience in relation to that?
Well, as you well said, Patricia, and Diana made a perfect introduction to the issue. Threats to land rights already existed before the pandemic situation, right? And now with the whole COVID situation, social distances, national, regional, and personal circumstances got into the way some at times while doing the alternative reports. Fortunately, each organization managed to be creative and resourceful at the same time in order to tackle this particular situation, right? As well as, I must say that teamwork and the strong commitment that organizations showed with land governance and gender equitable land tenure rights was strong enough to face the context, as well as, well, all the monitoring, training, and support that we received from ILC and Landesa, which was of great value in the process. And well, not to mention the financial support that allowed not only to hire researchers and consultants, but also experts in land matter. So that was of great value as well. That helped a lot while performing these reports. On the other hand, well, as Diana said, there is almost no information land related whatsoever. So when there is some information available, it's, as she said, extremely vague, or sometimes it's even difficult to comprehend or analyze for community in general. So that was a struggle. And well, as she also said, most governments decide not to include land-related SDG targets or indicators in their national voluntary reviews. So it was even harder for us to manage to compare and contrast, right, both reviews or to get some previous information. And in this context of social distances and pandemic crisis, right, public offices were closed, so it was even harder to get direct information from the government. I mean, if it wasn't online, then you had no chance to get it whatsoever. You couldn't go and knock the door, right, to the public office. So yeah, it was quite a struggle, but we managed. Yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, no, thank you, Liv. That's very clear. But I just want to move on to the next round of questions. But before that, we can see some questions are coming in. So if you have any questions or comment, please go to the icon called Q&A. You can type your question there. So I'm going to move on to the last round of questions before opening the floor for the discussion. As you said, now it's somewhat challenging in relation to reporting on land targets. And COVID-19 has posed extra challenges as well in this context. So we really want to look forward to 2021. So in 2020, things were hard, things were difficult. So, but 2021, how that's going to be like. And mind you, we have only 10 years to achieve the 2030 agenda. So I'm going to look at 2021 and beyond and ask from each of you, in your role right now, representing the role that you are currently at. So what do you suggest for 2021 for countries to meet the land targets by 2030? So Patricia, what do you suggest? How should countries report and what they should be doing to report on land targets?
Yes. The first thing that I have to say, and I think that most people that knows me know that I have been saying this since 2013, is that we cannot rely on governments to implement the goals. There is a difference between reporting and implementing. And many people heard from me about this, if we are to meet the targets and goals, we have to do these things differently. We have to look at the change, and the change come from good policies, good governance. So my first thing is, we have to look at civil society. We have to look from bottom up. I think that the first thing we, Espaço Feminista, have been working from bottom up since 2015, working with local governments and state governments, but especially on local government, because first thing, we have to shift power between the governments and civil society and women in special. And to do this, we have first to use the goals and targets and indicators to inform this population, creating what we call political will. Political will doesn't exist. As the Minister of Brazil said, we have to acknowledge that there is, how can I say, conflict of interest. Land grabbers have no will to do women's land rights, families. We live in a very patriarchal society, machist society, so nothing is going to be granted for us. And it's not just reporting, it's really making a huge effort to implement good policies that can shift this, this situation. We in Espaço Feminista, we have been collecting evidence, and it's very important. It's very important to sit, and we are not against governments. We are in favor of governments, but we have to sit on the government and say, look, we have evidence. We have collected data and analyzed data and used data to shift, to make concrete shift in a multi-stakeholder platform, like in Bonito, in one municipality. We collect data, we analyze data, we discover that 75% of the people living in these urban and rural areas were very insecure. The land belonged to the municipality. And what we did, we called the government, and we are in a process of regularizing on the name of women in first. So it's this kind of things that we have to engage. But we are not doing just locally. We are doing locally, connect with national and global. And so I think that the first thing that we have is we have to work in coalitions. We have to work not just as a, as a civil society. We have to understand the role of private sector. We just did the work in the Zona da Mata Norte in one area. We compare the agricultural census between 2006 and 2017 against a huge public and private investment. We are talking about a huge Fiat Chrysler, how can I say, Fiat Chrysler plant. And we discovered that during this process, there is a big shift, and it was really women's land rights. And all the data that we have, all the indicators were showing that this project had a very bad effect. What we did, okay, using this data, informing women, and it's very important to shift power, we are not working just locally, as I said, nationally, with all these movements and networks. We sat with the government and say, look, public money is increasing. The size of women's property is, undermining the women's situation, and establishing a good conversation, say, you have to do better, and not just with government, and also with the private sector. So I think that we have to do this systematically, and also just to finish, it's very important that once we have these numbers, this evidence, we have to go a step forward. In Bonito, we have to build a very good evidence and analysis about what happened when women have tenure security. And we are talking about 75% of the, the municipality. What happened at family level, shifting power, ensuring women's right? What happens to the community? How this community will be in, let's say, 3 years? Is that going to be a big change in terms of infrastructure, in terms of environment? So that's what we have to do, and we have to do learning from each other in a South-South cooperation. I think I spoke too much.
Yeah, no, thank you, Patricia. So bringing that, building partnerships, and also, multiple of production of data by different groups, particularly from civil society as well, and also highlighting positive stories in this context. If these rights are being achieved, what it would bring to the society, to a country, for the benefit of it. I think I'm going to move to Diana. Diana, so what we should be doing to encourage reporting? I mean, also I'm going to ask like one question, because you work on data as well. Sometimes when civil society produce data and governments don't accept them, so they frown at data which is produced by other sources. So how also when you encourage civil society to report in the next decade, how do you make it like legitimate, that we produce legitimate data which is equally valid as a measurement target?
Great, thank you, Rukshana. And building on Patricia's comments, because she gave a lot of detail on quite specific examples, there are ideas that we should just take from there because they apply to all of us. And I'm thinking about the fact that we had to get to something concrete. Let's stop talking about generalities and vague statements. Let's get to what are the specific changes that can be done. We have to recognize that we all have a role to play. Obviously, government at different levels have very clear responsibilities that they have to enact, but we as civil society can support that process and can support it in a constructive way, contributing to the dialogue, contributing with evidence, and can support it from the perspective of holding people accountable as well. And so regardless of where you sit and whether you work at the local level, at the national level, at the global or regional level, we all can play a role here. I see one of the beauties of the SDGs as a mechanism to allow us to have a cohesive conversation and to try to all move in a similar direction, to therefore amplify what we're doing so that the change is significant and not just a collection of isolated interventions. And so on the comment on reporting, I want to make sure that we understand why we're talking about reporting here. Obviously, the really important piece is for people to act on their commitments. That's what we want to see. We want to see change on the ground. What the SDGs give us is a mechanism to advance those actions. And the way we can advance those actions is by leveraging the reporting. Otherwise, the SDGs are just a series of meetings that will happen behind doors or through Zoom now, but would not really translate into change in practice. And so I'm going to speak from the perspective of Landesa and the work that we're doing with the SDG Land Momentum Group. And what we thought was we need to help stakeholders report. The more positive noise that we make around this, the more important it will become in everybody's agenda, the more compelled governments will have to, will feel to act. And so what we thought was, well, this can be a really challenging process for people who have not been involved in these, in agendas like the SDGs, who are not used to moving in these circles. And so our first task was, how can we make this something easier, less intimidating, and an area where people see the importance of reporting. And then the second piece is, how do we make sure that when people report, they actually contribute information that's useful, information that helps them think about what they want to prioritize, information that signals to their governments or to their constituencies what they're doing and what they should be doing and what they plan to do in the future, and information that signals to those who are funding this work in which direction we're all moving. And for examples like the one Patricia mentioned, how can people working in related or similar issues somewhere else in the world see that they have challenges in common or that they can do work together? And so it was important not only to convince people to report, but also to convince people to do it in a way that was meaningful and that was easy to read and to compare and contrast. And then the third piece was the information has to be easily available to people. We cannot have to go through multiple layers of websites in the SDGs and manuals and voluntary reports looking for one paragraph lost somewhere in there. We need to have something that is easily accessible. So what we're doing is we created templates, relatively simple templates for governments and for civil societies, and we're working on doing something similar for groups on the ground so that they can use the very specific commitments that were made under the SDGs, essentially a commitment to ensure that everybody would have secure land rights, a commitment to ensure that small agricultural producers would have access to land, and a commitment to ensure that there would be gender equality when it came to land rights. So for each of these commitments, we're asking government, civil society, and groups on the ground to look at, okay, what is the relevant authority, the relevant government structure planning to do? What are they saying in their country, in their locality that they will do? What changes have they introduced when it comes to legal reforms or policy reforms or institutional governance? What programmatic actions are they introducing? And then what's going on? What is the data telling us? How bad or how good things are, for whom? How is that changing over time? And this ties back to your comment or to your question, Rukshana, on data. I think we need to get less hung up on whether this is the official data and whether there is the data that's reported through all the official channels, which of course has value and which of course we're trying to build towards. We all need data. We are desperately craving for that. And different people are working at different levels to make sure that that infrastructure exists. But that infrastructure will take time. It will be years before most countries have reliable primary data that's meaningful and that meets all the criteria that we want to see. So in the meantime, people's lives continue to happen and people's challenges continue. What can we do to address that? It is of course possible that groups of women can gather some data and use that data to advocate for their changes. It's of course possible for the private sector and for other initiatives to support these efforts with data. And it is obviously a responsibility of the national statistical agencies to think of what infrastructure they're building for their future. These are all things that combine together to eventually translate into change on the ground.
Yeah. So thank you, Diana. I know that we got about 27 questions and we have limited amount of time, but Liv, there was a question for you and which asked actually why governments are not reporting. Why are they reluctant to report on land targets? And you are coming from the civil society, and when governments are to report in the next decade, what do you have to say? Why are they not reporting, and what do we have to do from the civil society part to encourage them to report?
Yeah, well, it's quite a challenge. I think that since land-related information, it's so difficult to come across with, as Diana just explained, we believe that it's necessary to strengthen the dialogue between the civil society and the governments in order to get direct information, or not, but to get a dialogue with the government. And at the same time, to create opportunities for the civil society to present their reports to the government and then work together, right? At the same time, we believe that, the technical and financial support that it will be extremely necessary for next year, as well as the training and financial support in order to hire consultants, experts, and researchers in the matter. And also, we believe it's important to generate a common communicational strategy.
Yeah,
in order to help and assist civil societies to communicate to the. Sorry.
Yeah, it looks like we're having some technical issues in hearing you. If you can repeat in 30 seconds what you said, and then we move on to the next question. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, last point then. I think that it's important, we believe it's important to generate a strong communicational strategy to help and assist civil society's organization to communicate their reports, not only to the government, but also to community in general. Community needs know also about the alternative report. Did you hear me? Did you manage to hear me? Please
Yeah,
say yes.
I think the message from you is, yeah, there were some still technical glitches, but the message is that we have to have a civil society part, clear communication strategies once we have the report to communicate the results and reach out to like a wider community. All right, so we have a number of questions. As you said, Patricia, there's an interesting question for you. And it asks, do you in Brazil have any legal provisions to protect land rights for single women? So it further says, in spite of legal provisions, we don't see much difference in land holding by women in India. Thanks for that question, Patricia.
Yeah, okay. So it's a very good question, and yes. And for instance, in this area in Bonito, we create the laws are to be interpreted, and we can interpret and use in our favor. So yes, we are doing, for instance, in Bonito, we are doing this regularization process, people living there for 30 years without any, security of tenure. We are using this regardless of their marital status, because as I said, and also to LGBT, doesn't matter, the kind of arrangement you are, we are protecting the rights of women, single women. The titles are going to be first on the name of women, and then if they are married, if they are not married, they are living with someone, then the second layer is for the men. So yes, we have, and we have used and interpret in our favor.
Okay. Diana, there's a specific question for you. It says, how the tenure security within the customary systems or over common or communal land or forestry or water are measured when countries report on land-related SDG indicators. So how do you basically report on customary systems or common lands? Yeah.
Yes. Very quickly, I want to say that on the data side, on the indicators, we very deliberately chose indicators that look at the final outcome. So we are asking people, or we're asking governments to report whether people say that they feel tenure secure, and whether people feel that they have, or think that they have a document that can prove they have rights to land. And so we chose these indicators, understanding that there are many different regimes in the world. This means that if somebody is living under a customary regime or under communally managed lands, they can still tell us, do they feel secure? We are not, at this level, we're not distinguishing whether the insecurities come because of the government, because of private sector concessions, because of families or in-laws. We want to make sure that people feel they are secure in on the land that they're using and accessing. That's number one. And the other one is, do they have documents to prove whatever rights they have? And the idea here is, will the government protect those rights? Unless there is some documentation, the government doesn't have the same type of responsibility. And that documentation could be, as is often understood in certain areas, a legal title, but the documentation can take many different forms, as long as the government is willing to protect it. And so one could have a situation where a community has title to an entire area of land, and people within that community, by the fact that they're members of the community, have rights to that land. The question there is, can you show somewhere that you are a member of that community? We want to make sure that people do not fall through the cracks and something happens later and the community leaves them behind, or the government leaves them behind, or their family leaves them behind.
Yeah. All right. So we're going to move to the last 10 minutes of the webinar. So I'm going to hurry up with the questions. So one question, because we talk about partnership building, particularly with the private sector. So the question is, how can the private sector, especially the land documentation technology, I think owned by the private sector, partner with the non-profit sector and ensure they are having a positive impact? So basically, how can private sector engage with the non-profit sector? Does anyone of you want to take this question? Yeah, Diana, please go ahead. I think I can see you nodding your head.
Go ahead. But I think Patricia was jumping to try to answer.
Patricia?
No, it's up to you,
first,
Diane. Okay.
Diana, first you go, and then we go to Patricia. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, of course, like with government and with civil society, there are many different ways in which the private sector can engage. So I want to make sure we value all the different ranges of contributions that can be made. Number one, they can institute good practices when they are starting or expanding their operations in a certain area. They are very well positioned to try to ensure that there's clarity in who has what rights and how those rights are protected. And they are in a position to enforce other actors through the value chain to comply to those same standards as well. In addition to that, in many countries, the private sector, or at least certain actors in the private sector, have a very specific open door or more open door to compel the governments to act and to implement, either to introduce legal changes or to implement them or to regulate them in a way that allows everybody to have more clarity about those rights and to be more transparent about what's going on. We have to be careful though, because under current circumstances, and I'm thinking of the pandemic, governments are going to be strapped for resources. And this is therefore a time where there are plenty of opportunities for stakeholders of all groups to sidestep good guidelines. Private sector can also help with data, can also help with lessons learned and so forth. So there are many challenges that we can consider.
Yeah, okay. Patricia, in the interest of the time, I'm gonna post a different question to you. And the question is about, it says the land rights picture in general for women's tenure security is rather grim. Do any of the panelists have a positive story on successful women land rights in terms of SDG targets met? That's what the question. So the question is, we want to hear a positive story. Is there a positive story that we can share with Patricia?
I think, yes, there are many positive stories. I think that, you know, learning that I'm not against monitoring or informing, creating reports, but we have to be, as I had many conversations, we have to be actionable, and action happens on the ground. We have very many positive stories of ensuring land security. What we want, and the private sector has a role, and a huge role as the donor, as the international community has an obligation to help, especially in this phase of post-COVID, because post-COVID is going to be a threat. If you look at we have to take a step back and look at the spirit of the SDG agenda as a whole and say, we have to buy this, and not just think about land in isolation, but the intersectionality. We are talking about water, we are talking about everything. So we have very nice, positive stories. It can happen if civil society, and I'm gonna talk about data and building evidence, the importance of building evidence. In Brazil, we are very lucky. We have national statistic data, demographic census, agriculture census, and using these to create analysis from a gender perspective and informing governments. And the private sector is here to build the platforms so that all this data can be accessed everywhere. Women on the ground in very remote areas are using technology. We are doing our capacity building through this high technology. So there is a lot of action. There is a lot of examples. We have to do, tomorrow I have a meeting with our friends from the Feminist Land Platform. We have to learn from each other. It's not just working on the very ground, but creating evidence, creating stories, creating, let's say, synergy. establishing these huge platforms. So that's the good news.
Okay. So I think before we wind up this, because we are moving to the last 5 minutes, there's a very important, this can be a comment, though it's a question. So it says, hello panelists, this is a good initiative. It would be good to discuss what the custodians have done and what tools are available. Reporting is not just by CSOs, but also by the governments. They have a responsibility. What about the work of the Global Land Indicators Initiative has been doing with CSOs and governments? Maybe you're not aware about what's going on right now, but I mean, I'm just going to open the floor to all the panelists and get their thoughts on this.
I can start.
Yeah, go ahead, Diana.
Yes, I think this specific area of work relates to the efforts that I was talking about when it comes to building what I call the global infrastructure on data on land rights. What has been done is obviously the metadata for these indicators has been developed, and tools and questionnaires and examples on how these can be introduced in different surveys has been done. And considerable work trying to get international surveys to include these modules. And there's work with different statistical agencies to build capacity. So this is a long-term area of work. It will take many years for the national statistical agencies in most countries to be ready to do this. And it will take years to have data because all of these surveys are not done every year. They're done every 3 to 5 years. And so the path is there. I think we are taking steps in the right direction. We still need to do a lot more. Like in all the other areas that we discussed, there's capacity challenges. How many people, how many resources? And then there is how can we do this in a concerted way so that when we take a step, we're not going to be able to handhold every country, every government office, every stakeholder here. So we need to think back to what Patricia was saying. We need to think of how do we do this in a way that every good example gets amplified and can be picked up by others. There is work to do. There's work translating some of these documentation. There's good work publicizing what's being done. And there's steps that can be taken in the meantime so that the conversation continues and we don't wait until we have perfect data.
All right. So I think we have come to the last few minutes of the webinar. There were a lot of questions. I apologize that we cannot address all the questions because of the time restrictions. So there's one interesting comment, or you can, it came as a question, whether we have any examples where civil society has worked with the government and in reporting, and what are those stories? Okay, so maybe you can highlight on that, but I'm gonna pass the mic to each of the panelists to give one message that the audience of this webinar can take home. Yeah. So Patricia, can we start with you? And you can reflect even on the last question that I mentioned as well.
Yeah, I think that it's for all of us, no one is going to achieve anything if we don't create this kind of partnerships and understand that, it's a donor's responsibility, it's a government's responsibility, it's a civil society responsibility. I just received a question about domestic violence. We have to create another culture, especially after this COVID. This COVID is a huge shame. It's a huge challenge for the future. It's not going to be better in 1 year time. So we have to think about how can we support each other. What are the connections that we have to make, how to really work in partnership with governments, using all the evidence, the data that we have been doing, the good results that we have been doing, but overall, we have to protect lives, and all the lives matter. We have to do this.
Okay. Thank you, Patricia, for that. I think I'm going to pass the mic to Liv, if you're there. So
Yes,
please, please.
On behalf of the SDGs initiative, we believe it's important to acknowledge the centrality of land issue and to end for ending hunger and achieving sustainable development. Civil society needs to be committed in the process to ensure gender equitable land tenure rights, since their landfill experience is vital. So they need to be.
Sorry, we're unfortunately having some difficulties in hearing you clearly. I'm really sorry, Liv, but I think the message is basically the engagement of the civil society, together with that, the space for the civil society as well, in terms of their ability to report and also the resources for them as well. Am I right? Yeah.
And their landfill experience, yeah, because it's vital for the process.
Yes. Okay, wonderful. And Diana, the last message from you.
Yeah, just very quickly, let's make sure we don't get distracted by COVID-19 and the urgent pressures that will come, and understand that this continues to be a foundational issue we need to work on. We can all contribute different pieces. Let's be strategic, and let's make sure that we amplify what we're doing so that we can move forward in an effective way.
Wonderful. So COVID-19 is not an excuse not to report and to be on track. Okay, and as I said, this is the last decade of SDG implementation, and the time is almost running out. So how we can come together as a community to report on SDG land targets. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining this webinar. And this webinar will be available on YouTube, and we will send you the link. We got the email addresses of all of you. And then also there will be a link for the evaluation of this webinar. We really appreciate if you can fill that evaluation form and send your comments so we can improve in the future. So a big thank you to all the panelists for your time, for your thoughts, for your ideas that you have shared, and all the participants for taking part and for the questions. Sorry that if every question couldn't be accommodated, but we hope to engage with you in the future and continue with this discussion. Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you to all.
Thank you for the invitation. A pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much for being here. And let's work together.
Thank you, Patricia. Yeah.